Good evening. Thank you very much, Ertuğrul, for that nice introduction. It's a pleasure, again, to be a presenter here at the Global Conversations series in this beautiful library. I want to thank all of you for your interest in foreign affairs, for your participation here this evening. Our convener, Global Minnesota, strives to be a leader that connects its members with the world and to give them tools to better understand the political, economic, social, security, and other challenges before us and before our country. It's a membership organization. Activities such as this depend on members. So I want to thank those of you who are members, and those of you who are not, I hope you'll please consider becoming one today. Our topic this evening is Turkey. These are some of the recent headlines of items in the newspapers and in the think tank press. Some of them are provocative. All of them reflect concern, if not alarm, about the country and about U.S. interests bearing on it. Some of you looking around at the room and while we were standing outside, I recognize have come to previous talks on Turkey that I've given for Global Minnesota here at this library and elsewhere. And those often began with kind of an assessment of history and some of the underlying factors to think about as one reads the headlines and the news events bearing on Turkey as a way to give context and a sense of nuance, help people see beyond what you might be reading about in the papers. Recognizing that a number of you heard that talk, or a variant of it, I'm going to take today a somewhat different approach. And my aim will be to discuss the sharpest points of aggravation that threaten American interests in and with Turkey, the problems that collectively constitute the crisis that currently exists in our relations. I hope in doing so to illuminate some of what those problems are, also give you a sense of the dilemmas that policymakers in our country and of course also in Turkey face. And we can backfill some of the context and nuances as in the course of the discussion. So I want to start with competing concerns, or maybe a less polite word, competing complaints. On the U.S. side, Turkey's current ongoing intervention into northwest Syria that you've read about in the last number of days seems to directly challenge American policy in that country. Turkey's warming ties with Moscow, with Tehran, with China, its vitriolic criticism of the United States and of the European Union, some of its relationships with some very bad actors, for many add up to a Turkey that maybe is no longer with us, suggests that maybe our longtime alliance is going to come to an end. Detentions of locally employed U.S. consulate staff and others on trumped-up terrorism charges have led to unprecedented concerns in that country about the safety and security of our personnel and nationals, prompted a shutdown in visa services late last year. And then there's the matter of rising authoritarianism, a weakening of the country's democratic institutions, challenges to the rule of law, and what these things mean for Turkey and what they might mean for our ties with it. On the Turkish side, there's a set of concerns as well. In the fight against the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, the United States seems to Turkey inexplicably to support a Syrian Kurdish group allied with the violently anti-Turkish Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, a terrorist organization. We seem inexplicably to allow the presence in our country to harbor, might be another verb, the man most Turks believe was the mastermind of the 2016 coup attempt, Fethullah Gulen. Mirroring Western concerns about whether Turkey remains committed to the alliance, so in Ankara, frustrations high over European and American policies affecting vital Turkish interests, but not always taking those interests into account, or seeming not to, including in the Middle East, in Syria, in Iraq, and elsewhere. So, to start some of the specifics, Syria is the sharp end of the stick pointing a big hole in the U.S.-Turkish relationship. Some of the problems there relate to unwise decisions, frankly by the United States, also by Turkish leaders. Other problems have to do with differing perspectives that relate, among other things, to the very fact that Syria is right there for Turkey. It's a long way away for the United States. And that, among other things, leads people, populations, and leaders to see things differently. But, Syria is so complicated, I don't want to simplify it, and what I've tried to do is break it down into 5 sets of things that are important: Assad, ISIS, the anti-Assad Syrian rebels, the Syrian Kurds, I already referred to a little bit, and kind of what's going on today in Afrin and Manbij and this complicated area in northwest Syria where fighting is currently underway. Start with this fine gentleman, Bashar al-Assad, and sort of the travails of Syria. The current travails began, to remind ourselves, in March 2011, when anger about police abuses boiled over into protests against the government that sparked harsh repression, that in turn sparked more protests and more repression, wave after wave, involving tens and then hundreds of thousands of people taking to their streets to protest his policies. That quickly became a full-blown revolt and the civil war that continues today. The photo was taken in Homs, Syria's 3rd largest city, home to 700,000 people, became the capital of the revolution, the Syrian revolution, after residents there embraced the call, voiced among others by President Obama, for Assad's removal, and they took that city over. Homs fell to government forces a couple of years later, and that picture shows you what it looked like after that campaign was over. We could update that. If you read the New York Times today, reports a bloodbath going on in the suburbs of Damascus, a suburban area home to about 400,000 people, 200 killed in the last 36, 48 hours by Syrian artillery and air force against essentially unarmed or lightly armed civilians. So Assad's forces lost large swaths of territory. This is a map, it's a current map of who controls what now. The counterpart map, say 2 years ago, would have showed the red, which is the Syrian government forces, kind of in this band, in a band right here. That was not theirs, this was not theirs, the stuff up in the north, they did not have control over. So Assad's forces had lost large swaths of territory. The country's future was in doubt until the intervention of Iran and Russia in 2015 turned the tide. Many once thought Assad doomed. It's worth noting that Turkey backed American efforts to try to bring about that demise. It now seems clear he will endure and in all likelihood regain control of the country, in all likelihood slowly, violently, perhaps incompletely, but almost certainly inexorably. Turkish leaders believe they joined the effort to depose Assad because his cruelty was unbearable and to support a U.S. effort that they thought would succeed. They miscalculated. The end game of Assad, or maybe more importantly of the revolt against Assad, now is a big part of the tensions between the United States and Turkey. Factor 2, the rise of ISIS. Again, to remind ourselves, ISIS is an offshoot of al-Qaeda in Iraq that burst onto the scene in 2014 in the form of gruesomely videotaped beheadings, the capture of Mosul, a city of 2 million in Iraq, and the conquest of much of northern and western Iraq and large parts of Syria. And the further map shows roughly the largest extent of ISIS control. And you can see there are big chunks of the northern half of Iraq on the western side, big chunks of Syria, and of course a lot of that space that's to the south is desert. There's no one there. So ISIS, the area that ISIS controlled, quite compelling. In response to this rampage, President Obama made it American policy to secure and support an international coalition designed, as he put it, to degrade and ultimately destroy ISIS. Turkey joined that coalition. It made available access at Incirlik Air Base outside the southern city of Adana for operations against ISIS, facilities we still use that shorten our pilots' flight times to the battlefield, so to speak, from about 5 to 6 hours from their alternative facilities to about 20, 30 minutes. Big contribution. The coalition has now nearly vanquished ISIS. Its Arab and foreign fighters are on the run. What the ISIS endgame means and for the future of Syria is a second big challenge in U.S.-Turkish relations over Syria. Third piece, the anti-Assad rebels. In response to increasing brutality against unarmed civilians, including the use of chemical weapons in August 2013, the United States, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia undertook to provide assistance to anti-Assad militia groups. Many of these coalesced around a loose entity that calls itself the Free Syrian Army, still calls itself that. This help included a scheme to provide training, equipment, and supplies. However, as our campaign against ISIS really starts to get going, that becomes America's priority, and our interest in these folks waned. Turkey's continued. The turn of the wheel in Syria and against ISIS may now open a new chapter for the rebel groups that remain. One of the largest calls itself Jabhat al-Fatah al-Sham, or the Front for the Conquest of Syria. It controls large parts of northwest Syria, below where Turkish forces are now engaged in Afrin. To Washington's extreme consternation, it is what remains of al-Qaeda in Syria, a big point of contention in our dealings with Turkey on Syria. Then there's the matter of the Syrian Kurds. And this map aims to describe kind of who lives where. The purple bits up at the top, those are or were predominantly Kurdish areas. The large brown is Arab. The green here, I believe, is Alawite. There are a couple of other pockets around, and some areas that are mixed, quite mixed in nationality. Syrian Kurds amount to about 10% of the country's population, and as you can see, concentrated in those bands along the north. And the colors are a little bit misleading because the Kurds in clumps concentrated in those areas, but there'd be a clump of Kurds and a clump of Kurds and a clump of Arabs, or a clump of Turkmen, or a clump of somebody else kind of mixed in with them. These are less homogeneous areas than the map suggests. So to get into the details, we have to do something that I kind of liken to walking down acronym lane. Kurdish is loaded with acronyms. The PYD, Kurdistan Democratic Union Party, is the dominant political entity in the Syrian Kurdish world. It was founded by, and frankly is part and parcel of, the PKK, terrorist organization established in the 1980s by Abdullah Öcalan, a Turkish Kurd, to fight against Turkey and to establish an independent Marxist-Leninist state under his rule, of course, out of Kurdish areas in Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Over 42,000 Turkish citizens have died in PKK-related violence. Thousands have been killed elsewhere, and Iran, in particular, has been a recent target. The PYD, Kurdistan Democratic Union Party, has an armed militia. All these groups, everywhere you go in Turkey, there are in Syria, there are militias. Theirs is called the People's Defense Forces, or YPG. You'll have seen that acronym in the newspapers. Like the core PKK itself, both of these entities have a reputation, well earned, for ruthlessness, or worse. That's drawn the ire of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. The ISIS takeover of northern Iraq and Syria in 2014 immediately endangered millions of Kurds living in the areas that were overrun. The Iraqi Kurds, this is Masoud Barzani, the Kurdistan regional government in Iraq that he headed, mobilized forces to protect Kurds. So did the PKK, including the PYD, YPG in Syria. Enter the US-led effort against ISIS. We and others undertook to provide aircraft to blow them up, but had no real interest in deploying ground troops that would eventually be required to dislodge and fully destroy this organization. Barzani may have wanted to do that. He lacked the numbers. He had his own problems in Iraq. The anti-Syrian, the anti-Assad militias that we Turkey supported, frankly, faced more immediate threats from government forces, Syrian government forces. They weren't really willing to go elsewhere into Syria, say into that eastern part of the country where ISIS was concentrated. And into this vacuum stepped the YPG, which made itself quite interesting to the American military. Despite strong Turkish objections, the United States has provided extensive weaponry and training to something we call the Syrian Defense Force, SDF, down near the bottom, a ostensibly or theoretically multinational army we created to counter ISIS that in reality is dominated almost completely by the YPG. This highly effective army has been crucial to America's success, or the success of the coalition in demolishing ISIS. And its actions have saved an untold number of American and other lives. It's also sharply divided us from Turkey. To try to calm the Turks, we told them that our aid to the YPG was really only to fight ISIS. And then when it ended, we'd take our arms back and the collaboration would end. We also promised to constrain the YPG from going to or staying in places of particular security concern to the Turks. The United States kept neither commitment. Indeed, in mid-January, the Pentagon announced plans to develop and support, to the tune of $500 million in U.S. funding, a 30,000 soldier-strong permanent security force in northern Syria that will be staffed by the Syrian Defense Force, AKA the YPG, for what purpose or long-term strategy not particularly indicated. From the U.S. point of view, we allied with the only ground force on offer and defeated ISIS, a threat to Turkey, among others. As seen in Ankara, we joined forces with the specific Syrian Kurdish entity most hostile to it. That Kurds, this Kurdish political party is anathema to much of Syria's Arab majority, and that these Kurds have declared the territories they control, they've given it a name, Rojava, what they intend to be a separate and self-governing entity, solidifying their control over non-Kurds that live in areas that they control, looks to Turks like a recipe for more instability, more warfare, and more danger in Turkey. So fast forward to today. Days after the Pentagon made this announcement about a YPG-led security force that's going to be deployed and funded by the United States along the Turkish border with Syria, Turkey launched Operation Olive Branch, its second deployment into northern Syria. And this is a picture of their tanks on the move. This is a pretty current map that describes what the geography is. So this is Turkey, and Turkey's up there. This is Afrin, where the main operations we're reading about today are. The intervention that took place late last year moved into this area that separates the main body of the YPG, which is here, from the other main body of the YPG, which is here. You can see in the days, a couple of weeks since the Turkish operation started, they've come down from the north, they've come over from the east, and they've come up this way, sort of headed kind of down here. In this area includes a whole range of very bad actors, including the Al-Qaeda tied group that I referred to, as well as a few others. That whole Idlib province, a tough and dangerous place. The Turks' public line is that this deployment is to support anti-Assad militias, to protect friendly Arab populations. It's really to prevent the YPG from linking that deployment in the east with the deployment of the west and gaining control of that whole band along the border. How this will play out is obviously something to watch. One important piece is the main city in Afrin province, Afrin, which is home probably to, at this point, 60, 70, 80,000 people. What's going to happen there? Will Turkish forces confine themselves to the countryside where they've basically been cleaning it out of hostile elements? Or will they go into that city? Will they besiege it? And there's been talk of that, including by President Erdogan. Will they engage in street-by-street fighting to take it over? You can imagine an awful picture. What are these Al-Qaeda groups that are further to the south in Idlib? What do they do? Press reporting in the last day or two, pro-Assad militias backed by Iran making their way from points further south up through Idlib and especially Aleppo to join up with the YPG. An interesting recent development. The other piece that you'll read about is the possibility of U.S. forces coming into conflict with the Turks. Way over on the far western side is the town in the gray bluish area called Manbij. American troops are embedded there with YPG elements. And obviously there's the possibility of some danger for our people. So these Syrian matters, all of these things, kind of came to a head last week. U.S. National Security Advisor McMaster, Secretary of Defense Mattis talked with their counterparts in the Turkish government. And at the end of the week, Secretary Tillerson went to Ankara, met with President Erdogan and his foreign minister. The upshot was they agreed to set up a new consultative mechanism, and that was pretty much the words they used, to try to get the overall relationship right or deal with a range of problems, and especially to address each other's concerns in northern Syria. The immediate sense of crisis that has passed, sort of, although these dangers are out there. We'll see how this works. If the U.S. military continues unconditionally to support the YPG, it probably won't. So while all that's going on, there's a separate conversation that I referred to earlier. Is Turkey really an ally anymore? The cartoon is from The Economist about 2 weeks ago. Erdogan tickling the Russian bear as Uncle Sam looks on warily. The freezing of Turkey's EU accession effort poisoned relationships with most European governments, vitriolic criticism of the United States, including quite recently the President's decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, a government-fanned anti-Americanism, all kind of seem to confirm Turkey, the alliance is increasingly obsolete. A lot about this issue ends up being kind of fuzzy. Turkey's relationship with Russia is important. It's basically correct. It's not a good relationship. Its ties with China are limited by distance and by Turkey's affinity for the Turkic peoples of Western China, the Uyghurs. Dealings with Iran are constrained by history, religion, pride, arrogance. The breakdown of Turkey's EU bid had a lot more to do with decisions the EU made than with Turkey's actions. A clearer prism for talking about this drift and about how perceptions differ comes up in defense procurement, an esoteric subject. For over a decade, Turkey has been talking with foreign suppliers about developing an air defense system for the country. The leading competitors, American-made Patriots, a comparable, although untried, European system, the Russian-made S-400, and a Chinese knockoff of earlier Soviet-era air defense technology. In 2013, Turkey decided to buy Chinese. After a long haggle, they gave that up and announced late last year plans to purchase the Russian S-400. We and our NATO allies kind of have a problem with this. The S-400 is apparently a pretty good system, but it is not and cannot be compatible or interoperable with NATO systems. And the reason is obvious. We can't really have, through some kind of Trojan horse, a way for the Russians to see inside our air defense. So that means Turkey's system, and this is like $3 or $4 billion, will be a standalone one, not part of an integrated, comprehensive network that protects the whole alliance, which is why we have the alliance, to protect, everybody protects everybody else. Turkey is concerned about air defense and NATO integration, interoperability, but it has other priorities too. These include increasing the sophistication and proficiency of its own armaments industry, and especially lessening dependence on foreign suppliers and the vulnerability to possible cutoffs of supply. It's not unimportant in Ankara that the United States embargoed arms sales to Turkey in the 1970s. Or that in recent years we have repeatedly held up export licenses and congressional approval for arms sales of interest to Turkey that other allies didn't really have any problem purchasing. The S-400 may or may not make sense in terms of those Turkish priorities I described, and the details end up not being that important anyway. The damage to alliance unity is a little bit more significant. So to shift again, the coup. July 16, 2016, plotters seized state-run television, bombed the parliament, attempted to kill or capture the president. In violence that pitted soldiers against other soldiers, police and unarmed civilians, 270 people lost their lives, 2,000 were wounded. This was a huge trauma for Turkey that you can't, it's almost impossible for an American fully to grasp. The coup attempt was carried out by a cabal in the military. Most Turks believe that followers of Fethullah Gulen in the military and among civilians were involved in the coup if they did not in fact lead it. More than circumstantial evidence has come out that seems to confirm this, though the story is very complicated and proof, especially in the public domain, uncertain. The movement that Gulen has led emphasizes interfaith harmony and education. Very benign, wonderful things. It is also a tightly run network of highly secretive cells. It became prominent in certain walks of Turkish life, including the media, business, education, law enforcement, the judiciary, and the military. Gulen and Gulen-affiliated organizations supported Erdogan and the current government until a falling out that really started in 2012 and got worse steadily thereafter. Gulen lives in rural Pennsylvania, having fled to this country to avoid arrest by the Turkish military in 1999. Since at least 2012, Turkish authorities have complained about him and sought his return. They finally lodged a formal request for Gulen's extradition back to Turkey in late 2016, after the coup. And as far as Turks are concerned, that's where matters have sat since. Now, extradition is a legal procedure that involves a review of evidence and a court proceeding before the United States can hand somebody over to a foreign government. The extradition request filed by the Turks was reportedly fuller of accusations than actual evidence, especially evidence that would withstand scrutiny in a court of law and in an adversarial proceeding where Gulen would have lawyers too. The Justice Department has done some work with Turkish authorities on trying to substantiate the case, build it out, or detail it in a way that might make it sustainable. These haven't led to anything. They probably won't. The result is another big sore, open sore in U.S.-Turkish relations. The sore bubbles into our relations in another way. In early 2017, Turkish police arrested a Turkish national working at our consulate in Adana. They charged him with terrorism, and specifically with colluding with both Gulen and the PKK, which, if there are a few Turks here, this is probably the least likely, that he would collude with both of those organizations, one of the least likely scenarios. This individual, Hamza Uluçay, his duties involved translating Turkish and Kurdish for American diplomats. He worked for me and helped me when I served there. And also serving as liaison with the police and with district political leaders, which is to say Kurds. Those responsibilities for dealing with the police, where Gulenists were prominent, and Kurds, which of course may mean PKK, presumably the origin of his alleged offenses. Later in the year, police arrested Metin Topuz, a security assistant at our consulate in Istanbul, on terrorism charges based on alleged connections with Gulenists. His job included liaison with the police on consulate security and cooperative programs, so those police connections, presumably the basis for these charges. Then there's the matter, somewhat separately, of Andrew Brunson, a Protestant minister who's lived and preached in Turkey for 23 years, was arrested and charged last year for being a Gulenist, attempting to overthrow the government, and spying. President Erdogan has publicly linked his case with Gulen's, essentially suggesting that Turkey will hand over its hostage when the United States hands over Gulen. The Turks have apparently shared very little information about these cases with American officials. The charges look fabricated. Neither of the consulate staffers has diplomatic immunity, of course. They're not diplomats. They work for us in a different capacity. Our ambassador and the State Department concluded they had no choice but to act to protect the mission's local staff, and so announced in October the suspension of visa services until they could get some assurances regarding the security of their people. Turkey's embassy in Washington immediately responded with a similar work stoppage. It put out what I thought was an incredibly childish press release that copied word for word exactly what the press release of our embassy in Ankara, even though there was never any assertion by the Turks of security issues for its personnel. After 2 months, senior officials negotiated a restoration of visa services, apparently got some kind of assurances about our staff. All those people remain in jail. The breakdown of visa services was unprecedented with Turkey, or to the best of my knowledge, with any country ever in American history. It's difficult to see, really, how or whether matters were really resolved. My guess is this will continue to fester as well. The The fates of Hamza Uluçay, Metin Topuz, and Andrew Brunson, and there's some other names, are or seem often to be bound up in a broader problem of rising authoritarianism in Turkey that is a last big problematic piece in U.S.-Turkish relations and discord. Democracy has certainly seemed to be on a steady downward slide. The state of emergency rule implemented in the aftermath of the coup still exists nearly 2 years later. It's been used to detain indefinitely and without effective judicial review not only putschists and people with credible or maybe less credible ties with Gulen, but also mainstream opposition members of parliament, Kurdish nationalist MPs and mayors, media and academic critics of the government, business figures, some 50,000 plus in all. Some 150,000 have been fired for their jobs, for connections to Gulenists or for other reasons that range from perhaps logical to benign things, like having an account at a bank, the bank that happened to be the one down at the corner, which, oh, by the way, turned out to have been owned by someone allegedly connected with Gulen. Erdogan has moved to monopolize power. He narrowly won voter approval in a referendum marked by unprecedented accusations of fraud, unprecedented in Turkey, at least for many decades. Approval for constitutional changes that abolish the prime ministry and confer executive power on the president. Largely free now of potential parliamentary challenge or even oversight, because the changes didn't just swap out the head of state, head of government. There are a whole range of others that affected the parliament's power and authority. Hundreds of journalists are in jail, hundreds more have fled the country, as have thousands of academics. Tax, regulatory, and other inspectors often go after business and other critics of Erdogan or of government policies. By most accounts, corruption seems to have returned in a substantial way. The rule of law and the impartiality of the judiciary, never one of Turkey's strongest suits, shall we say, have been further weakened. One journalist critic arrested and sent for trial was ordered released by the Constitutional Court, the country's highest supreme judicial body, all of whose members were appointed either by Erdogan or by his predecessor and ally, Abdullah Gül. Prosecutors ignored that ruling, rammed his case through a lower court, secured a term of aggravated life imprisonment for somebody that the Supreme Court of the land had ordered released. Turkey isn't a police state, notwithstanding the things I've just said. It's always been more authoritarian than most other European democracies. It had seemed to have, at least until recently, all the raucous noise of political conflict and debate that more democratic societies have. Today, the independence of the media, the Electoral Commission, the courts, and the Parliament has been so undermined that these institutional safeguards of democracy can no longer play that function. Seeds of Turkey's future instability lie in that problem. The shared values piece that has underlaid the North Atlantic Alliance and that has underlaid U.S.-Turkish relations, at least over the course of the last several decades, suspect. So what's the future? Not a very informative slide. Turkey's descent into authoritarianism and its leaders' sometimes mercurial and stridently anti-American, anti-Western postures give rise to some legitimate questions about the future of our ties. Is it right or wise to ally with someone whom the economist calls a dictator? Should we instead look to others as possible regional anchors? Or if, despite their warts, we stick with Erdogan and Turkey, how in the world do we make things function in light of all those other dissonances, some of which are a little related to Erdogan, a lot of which are not? Since President Truman pledged support for Turkey in March 1947, U.S. policy has been to back and to cultivate it as an ally. The alliance never without problems. Its shortcomings and Turkey's deficiencies have been overcome or often overlooked by a Washington that gave priority to having a friend astride the Bosporus, having access to Turkish bases, having a Muslim majority country in our camp. The compelling case for continuing that strategy or that approach has based on similar assumptions. Allies are a good thing, a force multiplier, and not just in security, military terms, but in other ways. Turkey's location makes it especially valuable. Think Russia, think Iran, Iraq, Syria. Alternative partners got a lot of questions. Our relationship with Turkey, for all its problems, today would be extremely difficult to put back together in the future if things really fall apart. The problems in U.S.-Turkish relations suggest the way forward won't be easy, in part because of the personalities, I use plural, of our somewhat mercurial leaders, but also because of divergent priorities, perceptions, and to some extent interests that can be, but aren't being today, adequately addressed. A press report I read this morning quotes an unnamed National Security Council official as saying that they aim now to increase significantly the time and effort put in to the U.S.-Turkish relationship. It's good news. Making that succeed will require sustained attention, strong leadership, perhaps some luck. We'll have to see how it goes. With that, thank you very much for your attention. I think we'll have time for some questions.
So anyone with? Thank you very much for your talk. I have questions. We encounter Turks in two places. When we go to resorts in a place like the Black Hills, this is 2 years ago, before the coup. We had all these young workers over there from Turkey working where there weren't enough American workers. So in resorts, we find a lot of Eastern Europeans and Turks. Is there still a flow of young people? These are college kids spending the summer getting exposed to America. Do we still see that flow of people from Turkey to here happening, or has it been cut off now?
As far as I know, it continues. A lot of that travel is summer travel to, when the tourism industry needs workers, and so time will tell as we get toward the summer. The visa services now have been completely restored, so Turks shouldn't have any more difficulty than they had before acquiring an American visa to come for these purposes. And I believe the Trump administration has indicated that program of allowing foreign workers in for the tourism sector that they're going to continue that. Time will tell. Lots and lots of Turkish young people come to this country. More Turks come to study at our universities and colleges than any other foreign destination that they go to. And again, there too, as far as I know, that has not been adversely affected.
Hi. Here?
Yes.
I'm still a little confused about what the Gulen organization is. You described it as secretive, but it almost sounds as though, members of the PTA nationwide are being accused of a coup and then arrested. So I'm really befuddled about what it stands for. Is it public or like the Chamber of Commerce or something? It just sounds sort of like odd about what exactly it is and how its membership is developed or comprised or made up, I guess.
I will preface my remarks by saying I'm not a huge expert. I can talk about what I've observed and what people who know more than I do that I have respect for have written about or told me of. So I guess one important word, it's opaque. It's an opaque organization. Outsiders don't know the fundamental answers to your questions you're asking. Outsiders are not privy to that information. It's not like you can go on a website and find, their board of directors and their financial statements and their tax returns and, or the organizations. That stuff isn't available. Who's a member? That information isn't available. They don't like have a ring or membership cards, or they may have membership cards, but it's hard to know who they are. There's quite a lot of information that has come out in the Turkish media over the last 2 years or a little less now, that by people for whom I have a lot of respect. These are not sycophants of the government. These are not pro-government media. These are strident critics of Erdogan who have kind of dug into what are some of the facts. And they document a pretty steady record of recruitment and then of placement of people into key positions in law enforcement, especially in law enforcement, the police. When I was serving there, it was common knowledge that the Gulenists were very big in the police force. It didn't matter to us. The relations with the government at that time were perfectly fine. The Gulenist relations with the government were perfectly fine. It was sort of an interesting thing. You may recall 4 or 5 years ago, a series of spectacular trials of senior military officers who were accused of plotting against the government. There were 3 different plots: Sledgehammer, Ergenekon, and I've forgotten what the third one was. And these were hundreds of people. And the chief of the Turkish generals, or the former chief of the Turkish general staff, several other very, very senior Turkish military hauled into court and convicted, sentenced to, 5 or 6 life sentences. Which I don't know exactly how you do that, but it now is clear that these trials were organized and orchestrated by Gulenists in the procuracy, colluding or cooperating with their kinsmen, if that's the right term, in the judiciary to get convictions. The charges were fabricated, and that's been well and thoroughly documented by both Turkish experts and also outside experts. One, Danny Roderick, a professor at Harvard, whose father-in-law, I believe, was one of those accused, did some forensics on the documents that were there, and basically, according to him, they were produced using a version of Microsoft Word that didn't exist on the dates. It hadn't been, that was an earlier version. Now, is all of that true? I don't know. I tried to be careful in saying I don't know whether Gulen organized the coup or not. Although there's more than just a little evidence that points in that direction. Politically, the point is Turks think so. A senior member of the Republican People's Party, the party of Ataturk, it's the largest opposition party in Parliament, was part of a delegation that came to Washington a couple of weeks after the coup. And he's reported to have said something I found very interesting. He said, He's asked about where the coup came from, and he said, Turks agree on only two things: in Allah, and that Gülen is behind the coup. It's virtually universal. When I've been there, when I've talked to people connected with the government or the ruling party, I've talked to people in the opposition, I've talked to journalists who have no axe to grind one way, or they're not always well disposed to the government, but they're certainly not disposed to grind the government's axes. They all believe this. And at the end of the day, that perception is the problem, or the root of the problem that the United States has, or one of the problems the United States has with Turkey.
Ross, thank you much for outlining a very complex situation. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about our internal situation in D.C. I mean, it sounds like the Pentagon has a policy vis-a-vis Syria. The National Security Council now seems to recognize it needs to have a policy. And we don't seem to have, as I recall, there was some contact early between Trump and Erdogan that was actually somewhat positive. No, not positive. But is part of, how do we work out an internal policy so that we could then attempt to tackle the future? Is that part of our problem?
Well, part of our problem is that we haven't worked it out. So, in 2014, the U.S. military was essentially given the task, go destroy ISIS. And so military people given a mission, they'll find a way to do it. And they use the only ground forces on offer and let the chips fall where they may. There were people in the places that you would expect who pointed to how this could play out and what might be the implications. Those voices were not listened to. Secretary of State Tillerson gave a speech at Stanford the middle of January, laying out an administration strategy on Syria, it's in a sense it's not a bad speech. He says all the right things that you would want him to say, and including talking about the independence and the unity of Syria. Made reasonably clear it is not U.S. policy to either that the country be broken up or that there be an autonomous area for one nationality or ethnic group or anything of the sort. The problem is that the influence that we have today in Syria, that would be the U.S. military, because there is no embassy, and Tillerson's, I thought, aggressive ideas about what we want to see happen in Syria completely unmatched by any commitment of power, of money, of resources, of people, or anything else to make it happen. And so what you end up with is a country that's really being driven now by other forces. We're making pronouncements, and we're oh, by the way, actors with maybe 10% of the population sort of on our side. How this is going to work, I don't know. It may be that this remark by a senior NSC person will in fact kind of lead to some rethinking, but there was a conscious decision in 2014, we're going to do this and we don't care. Beck, or where's the...
Yes. So it sounds as if extraditing Gülen to Turkey might be a good way to try to start rehabilitating our relationship. And apart from allowing the legal process around extradition to play out, what is really blocking that? Does he have powerful allies in the Congress or other interests that are protecting him from extradition?
No, the problem is that is, as I suggested in my prepared remarks, you got to have evidence that looks like it's reasonably compelling to the U.S. Department of Justice, and that evidence then goes to a court in an adversarial proceeding, and nobody wants to start a case like that and lose, especially such a high-profile case. And so the justice won't act on this. I mean, they really, under their, at least as I understand, their policies and procedures, they need more evidence. They need something other than accusations. They need some documentation. Maybe we have some of that. I don't know. We do have some. Some of that's come out in the media. The Turks need to provide other material. That hasn't happened. The Turks have also been trying to kind of slice this problem in other ways. They said, well, if you can't do that, can you kind of put him under house arrest or impose limits on what he can do and how he can communicate, so that if, in fact, he's a coup plotter, he can't do it anymore. As far as I know, that also has fallen on deaf ears. Doing nothing is a disaster for us. What I've encouraged and others have said is, let's work with the Turks to try to substantiate the case and help them develop a reasonable one. And justice has tried that. It hasn't led anywhere, and it falls off of the to-do list. In the way Washington works with a million problems, it falls off the to-do list rather quickly.
Yes, I was wondering if Gulen is more at risk of extradition under the Trump administration than the Obama, or if it's up to the courts and not the president.
Well, you may be aware our brief National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn, talked about the time of the election, actually, and wrote an article essentially urging that we extradite him. Nobody in a senior position has really talked that way since. The Attorney General has sort of pointed to, the law and procedures and policies that govern extradition. At the end of the day, I don't think there's any meaningful change between the two administrations, because at the end of the day, the problem will be in the courts, and no one wants to take that case and lose. Although maybe you could make an argument, so at least try, and maybe that would make things better. I'm not sure that it would, in reality.
Secularism in Turkey for many years is losing ground to the benefit of religious fervor. Do you think that progressively and in the future, Turkey may move into some sort of a religious state or theocratic state like their neighbors? Thank you.
I'm highly skeptical that that's a realistic or likely scenario. The Turkish people and the nature of Turkish society is quite different from that of Iran or Iraq or even Syria or Egypt. And so I think it would be difficult and bloody and messy to try to make that happen. It hasn't obviously, although Erdogan and his allies have been quite aggressive in using religious symbols for their political ends, to advance their political ends. They've not talked about converting the country into a religious state. Quite the contrary. They want it to be their state. Thank you very much. They're not that interested, I don't think, in sharing political power with clerics, which doesn't mean that Turkey isn't becoming and may not become more dominated by Islam and sort of official life more dominated by Islam than it is today. But I think that's quite a different thing from what exists in Tehran. What might happen in 20 or 30 or 50 years, that's another matter. To me, that's one of among several reasons why I think it's in our interest to keep Turkey as close as we can to the West, despite problems, in order that You know, Turkey is a country of the East and the West. We get that. We want to keep that West part alive, and one of the ways is through our relationship.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. First, I am from Turkey, and I am here in Minneapolis last 6 months. So I was in Istanbul in 15 July, and I can say that this is the worst day I have ever seen. But after 15 July, our life doesn't change, because this is the worst day for me. I afraid too much, and I'm afraid as a mother, as a woman, as a lawyer, because all my life I believe rule of law, I believe human rights, and this night for me, for my country, for my son, for my family, it was very bad. But after this night, nothing has changed, and I am afraid today. We are afraid still today, because you explain a lot of things. State of emergency is continuing, and unfortunately, I am very upset to say that there is now no rule of law. There is no judicial independence. A lot of journalists, a lot of lawyers, a lot of judges in the prison, and most of them don't have any court. They don't know why they are. And now I feel, but I'm wondering your understanding. I feel that in Turkey democracy is under attack. Do you agree with me? If your answer is yes, what do you think, by whom? Because I want to know that by whom. As a Turkish woman, as a Turkish lawyer, I want to do something for democracy. Because of this, I am here. I am here for my education. I am a Humphrey Fellow in the University of Minnesota. And one of Humphrey Fellow, this year, for example, we are 2 Humphrey Fellow we chosen. One of Humphrey Fellow, she doesn't come here because she's working under government, and governments took her passport, and she doesn't here now. Like this, a lot of people, more than 1,000 people, government canceled their passport. And if you think, yes, our democracy is under attack, by whom? And if your answer is yes, what do you advise us because I want to do something for democracy in my country. What is your advice to us? Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. One of the things that I think, as I alluded to earlier, that Americans don't get, because this has never happened in our country, is just how traumatic July 15, 16 was, and how traumatic everything that has followed has been. Maybe things might be even worse if the coup had succeeded, but that doesn't really change the fact that terrible things have happened in the country. And when I was there a year ago, a couple of people talked with me about this, and I ended up kind of reformulating it in the following way. For the adult lives of an entire generation of people, life had been becoming better, freer, with more opportunity, more connectedness with the rest of the world, more modern, more European than ever in Turkish history. And boom, like that, it's gone. And it's gone partly because of the coup, but partly because of this vicious and over-the-top response by the authorities. In some ways understandable. A coup happens, government's going to go after the people they thought are responsible for it, but what's going on is something quite different, and it is the dismantlement of Turkish democracy as it has existed. And Turkey is not the most perfected democracy in the world, or was not, but it's quite something different now. Who's responsible? Well, that would be Tayyip Erdogan and the ruling party. Whether their aim is to destroy democracy or not, the actions that they have been taking are producing that effect by systematically weakening the institutions that constitute democracy. One American academic, Sardar Chaptai, said that Erdogan on democracy issues, he's been like at a donor place, slicing off little bits one at a time. You almost don't notice it, but cumulatively it starts to have an effect. What should people do? Turkey is, I would hope that Turkey is still enough of a democracy that the voters have to make this change. The opposition political parties in Turkey, weak, feckless, completely uninterested or unfocused on the aspirations of what is now the majority middle class of the country, and all sitting on large bank accounts, enjoying their seats in parliament and the privileges that go with that, and not organizing to try to confront the situation that exists. Turkey will have to have another mass political party, not a little one that appeals to 20% of the population, but one that can credibly compete for the mass of the voters. And until that happens, or the actuarial timetable goes forward, Erdogan is mortal like everybody else, it's hard to see how things will change. But I'll come back. A significant share of the responsibility for Turkey's democracy deficiency today rests with the opposition, and has going all the way back to 2002 when the AKP first came to power.
Question about the, over here, the Zarab case and Hulk Bank. I realize you might not have had time to talk about it, but I wonder if you perceive that confession to be almost peripheral, irrelevant to this crisis, or if you see it potentially unraveling further the relationship.
When I started to prepare this talk, that was one of my things, and it was just too many pieces to try to walk through. If everybody knows, Zarab is a Turkish-Iranian guy who apparently colluded with Iran and with officials at Halkbank, which is one of Turkey's larger state-owned banks, on schemes to evade U.S. sanctions through a complicated gold trade, and the details get really murky quite quickly. Zarab pleaded guilty in a New York court last year, for reasons I can't figure out, he came to the United States and got arrested. Why he was perfectly fine while he was in Turkey, from his point of view. At any rate, he came here, he got arrested, he confessed. The Turkish government was, at the time of his trial and then at the time of his confession, quite vitriolic in their complaints about everything associated with the case. There's a school of thought that Zarab knows things about Erdogan's, either the personal involvement of Erdogan or of other people close to him, and that was the reason that why Turkey has tried to muzzle this. It's kind of dropped out of the discord. In the aftermath of Secretary Tillerson's visit, the U.S. and Turkish governments put out a kind of a paper to describe this consultative mechanism, and it lists a whole bunch of issues that they're going to talk about. And I don't remember this one being there. Turkey's big concern is sanctions against Halkbank, which is a big bank, and maybe with a many billion-dollar bill that might be attached to it. That's a negotiable problem, and that may go away. What happens to these other accusations, that's a different matter, and obviously it'll depend on exactly what comes out and when and what the prosecutors choose to do.
Yes, thank you, Ambassador. I was just wondering, you had mentioned that after the coup, basically, Turkey started to become less free and more autocratic. How much of that was in place before the coup happened? How much of that was in response to it? And how much of that was Erdogan really chipping away at that and then being able to just take advantage of the coup post facto?
The centralization of power has, in Erdogan, had been going on for a while, including within the ruling party as he got rid of alternative voices and people who would argue with him, at least in internal debates. And the media was, before the coup, already under a certain amount of assault. You already had a large number, I don't remember what it was, but it was certainly dozens of journalists in jail for having insulted the president, for security offenses, for any variety of other things. The political tension and polarization got a huge impetus after the Gezi Park protests. And its huge outpouring and Erdogan's demonization of them as traitors, and so there are a lot of things that were going on before. Erdogan took advantage of the coup to ram through approval of these constitutional changes. Fired his prime minister, his first prime minister after he became president, Ahmet Davutoğlu, because Davutoğlu thought he was there to be prime minister, and expressed contrary views about the wisdom of this referendum, and so he, get rid of him. Anyway, so Erdogan uses the post-coup atmosphere to kind of really ram this thing through. And the current round of developments, I think, really flows from that. But I come back to something I said earlier. Turkey has always been a more statist, more authoritarian country among NATO democracies or countries that sort of more or less fall within the democratic camp, and that authoritarian character was alive and well before Erdogan ever got into leadership in the first place. That's a product of the military written constitution for the country that was essentially imposed after the 1980 coup. Erdogan has taken advantage of the authoritarian aspects of that constitution really from the time he assumed office.
You had mentioned earlier about the role of the air defense system adoption by Turkey, and by inference the role of NATO and Turkey's position. The U.S. seems to have not wanted to assume great leadership in NATO currently, but what is the European, and you may not be in a position to answer that, but what is the European response in terms of NATO's role particularly as it relates to Turkey?
I probably won't give you a very good answer because I've not thought about it. It's a good question. I guess my answer would be our European allies, like Turkey also, attach immense importance to NATO, and they're horrified by, or have been horrified by the things that they heard from candidate Trump during the election, by what they heard from President Trump when he went to NATO, part of his first trip abroad. They're very uncomfortable about that. And to that extent, at least, they would have a certain amount of common cause with Erdogan. Having said that, Erdogan, this vitriolic anti-Western attacks that Erdogan is given to, one of the prominent episodes had to do with the constitutional referendum. And the government wanting to try to drum up the maximum vote from Turks living abroad, and so wanted to have campaign rallies in Germany and Holland and France and other countries, and local political leaders saying that's not the way it works. You can do that whatever you want in your country, but we don't want you to be doing that here. And then that led to a giant war of words. So Erdogan has made lots of enemies in Europe, and as he has in the United States, and that's something that as I look at what Turkey does and Turkey's reaction, that those first set of complaints, and there's a longer list, of course, they don't always reflect on the enemies they've made for themselves and what are the consequences of that. Foreign affairs is about relations among foreigners. And if you don't get along with somebody very well, why are you going to help them out? Well, it's not very interesting. And anyway, there's been huge cost to Turkish interests because of that, and some damage to ourselves through the kinds of things and the positions that the present administration is taking on international issues.
Excuse me, I had a question on what's Turkey's view of the Iranian presence in Syria, and do they share that concern with the U.S. in any way?
Turkey's not happy about it. When Iran first intervened in 2015, it was to support this butcher, Bashar al-Assad, that Turkey was working hard to have go away. They have joined in recently into negotiations with the Russians and the Iranians on possible future political arrangements in or affecting Syria. So there were talks that began in Astana, Kazakhstan, I want to say something like October, November. There have been a series of follow-on talks, and there was a report I read, I don't know if this is true, that the three leaders, Rouhani, Putin, and Erdogan, are supposed to be getting together in the next couple of weeks to try to further this. And I'm a little thin on the details, but I think what they essentially agreed was to try to set up some stabilization areas in Syria, places that would be free and peaceful. One in a certain area that the Iranians would kind of be in charge of, another in the north, in Afrin, and some adjacent territory that the Turks would kind of be responsible for, and I don't know what the Russians were going to get. They were maybe the Syrian areas under Syrian government control. And that's another part of the complications in Syria, because there are a lot of different players jockeying for position as the end game of ISIS, the end game of the revolt, come into focus. Clearly, Syria will be entering a new phase, and Russia is trying to maximize its position. Iran is trying to maximize its position, protect its interests. Turkey trying to maximize, protect its position. The United States kind of doing that, although, as I alluded, I don't think they've figured out exactly what we're supposed to do or how we're going to make that happen. And that's a big and important part of the dynamic.
And we'll have one final question.
Hi. I wanted to highlight actually two things. Earlier in your presentation, you mentioned that Turkey was a good partner to United States for many years, right? So do you think that the intervention or the support that United States gave in an arrogant way, let's say, to the Kurdish military group in Syria, without maybe consulting their partner Turkey, was the first mistake that was, let's say, the cause for to bring, let's say, all this alteration or all this reaction of Turkey towards the other allies or the other partners in Europe or with United States? This is one. I'm sorry. I am from Albania, and I think that ISIS is more near us than United States, and we really are thankful to United States for supporting the war against ISIS. It's a threat for all the world. It's not only for us that are more near them. But I believe that, I don't know, it will be the best way to go and to make a good partner, like Turkey in the time, part of our war against ISIS, and not put them against.
So on your first point, the line that I tried to use in my prepared remarks, Syria is the sharp end of the stick that's poking a big hole in U.S.-Turkish relations. It's not the only one, and although I focused on kind of contemporary things, there's a long list, a very long list, just going back over the 12 or 15 years of U.S.-Turkish relations that I'm familiar with, that includes problems just as big as this one, and you know, all those things kind of accumulate and accrete and complicate one another. I don't think that our support of the YPG in the context of Turkey's objections is the one and only thing or the main driver of problems. I also think there were ways when we entered into that relationship with the Syrian Kurds to have made it work, and made it work in a way that would have been okay for Turkey, including in particular to leverage that relationship to get both of those sides into different places. Syrian Kurds aren't going to go anywhere. They're going to be there forever. Turkey isn't going to go anywhere. They have to get along eventually. And so a sensible policy or strategy would have been to try to work on that space. And there were people who advocated that at the time. Military wasn't interested, and they were kind of driving the train. On your broader point about ISIS, I absolutely agree. It is a blessing for humanity that these awful people are no longer on the scene or able to do the terrible things that they were doing. That has benefited Turkey. Turkey has been part of that coalition. It flew combat aircraft on missions against ISIS until they had a little fracas with the Russians that sort of put Syrian airspace off balance. But they've cooperated and helped out in a whole variety of ways. The task, I think, before us now is how do we work these dissonances and get things into some kind of a manageable place, and to put it mildly, that won't be easy. I'll leave it at that. It's probably not a very good answer. But.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Wilson.